He's also a professional engineer, has established 3 businesses in China, has met with or negotiated with every level of government, worked for several years in Ontario, healthcare system, helping with the construction of 2 hospitals and managing hospital operations and facilities. We had a fascinating conversation last night over dinner about hospitals and sustainability. So I suspect the 7 people who were grilling me would love to have some time with you to have that discussion. Of course, now Peter is the Executive Director of the Sault Ste. Marie Innovation Centre, focused on building up the digital, smart city, advanced manufacturing, and ag tech components of the economy. Please welcome me in joining Mr. Peter Bruijns.
Hi, everybody. First, I want to introduce a little bit about the Innovation Center. It's our 20-year anniversary, although I've only been there a year and a few months. We have 50 staff. We have a strong technology focus. Our revenues last year were about $5.6 million. We are funded substantially by NOHFC and FedNor, where we deliver a number of programs on their behalf in the agricultural technology sector, the digital technology and software development, and in business support services. Now I want to move on to why I did this presentation in the first place. You can see the title there, but when I got to the Innovation Center, I thought, well, I know a lot about every other city in Ontario, and I've studied a lot of cities in the United States. Every single city has the same problem. Unemployment's high, wages are dropping, international competitiveness is rising, and climate change is getting out of hand. And nobody seems to be able to come up with a solution. So I thought I would look at household incomes and figure out what could the Innovation Center role be in helping drive up average incomes in Sault Ste. Marie, because that's really what we want, is a thriving, healthy, economically viable city. And then when you create that, well, then you attract lots of people to come and join you. So that's why I did this. And then when I set out in the journey, it started to combine a number of things that interconnected. So I'm going to get into it. I think that there's 2 cancers that have been affecting our country and basically global economies for 50 years. And we have one neurological disorder, which is the acceleration of automation, which I'll get into later. So these are metaphors for global forces. And then when you look at stakeholders in a global economy, you have government, you have large multinational corporations, you have the household, and you have small independent business. Just to get an idea of what definition is, a small independent business is actually something like Algoma Steel. They are large, they're in one geographic location, they do not have the ability to move production in different places around the world. An MNC, by this definition locally, would be Tenaris. Multiple plants all over the world, driven by a global head office, I think, in South Africa. And then you look at the 2 cancers that we experience in our society and the United States as well. I'm focusing more on a North America approach to all this, but geopolitical compromise and wealth siphons, to me, are a fundamental harm and what's actually been a contributing factor to climate change, income degradation, and government deficits. And then we have the technology acceleration, which we'll talk about later. So let's define geopolitical compromise. It is a trade agreement between one or more countries where foreign worker rights, environmental legislation, human rights, security issues for people are not governed and regulated within that agreement to parallel anything in our domestic market. A wealth siphon is a mechanism that takes wealth out of an economy and delivers it to a small number of people. An example of this is share buybacks in the global market. We'll talk about that a little bit. Ultra high executive compensation. And these are 2 forces that drive a whole lot of activity globally. And then when you look at geopolitical compromise, this whole idea of freedom with zero responsibility, if you look at what we had in the early 80s in Canada and the United States, we had worker rights that were protected. Unions had a strong hold on negotiating fair wages. Utilities are expensive. Environmental regulations were strong. Then you looked at China as an example, and I have the most experience with China. You look at all the attributes that they did not have to contribute cost to when you moved a factory to China from North America. And so you factor the cost of all that in, and then you look at what the impact is on your local society. Well, how do we compete when not only do we have wage disparity, but we have disparity on every other element that we've been building up our economy to justify and to protect our quality of life. So then, after that, the trade agreements opened everything up in the 80s. Well, factories started moving. Plants started opening in Mexico. Contracts were set to either establish manufacturing projects in China or licensing manufacturing and then importing the goods back to North America for distribution in our market. Then you can see the trade deficits that escalated from that very behavior. So right now the trade deficit in current times is actually over 600 billion in the United States. So it's actually about double the height of that first graph. Mexico, it's growing quickly. And all of that represents wealth that left our economy using geopolitical compromise to another economy. You look at companies that thrived in this sort of environment. Walmart was the first. They essentially built the first and best logistics pipeline connecting foreign jurisdictions that could manufacture projects cheaply and connect it into a distribution system in North America. And then once they perfected that through retail stores, well, then the online business simply plugged into that. And then you see Amazon and Wayfair, and you see how their sales have skyrocketed over the years in parallel to companies moving manufacturing offshore and that sort of thing. So if any of you people have spent time in China, I was there in the mid to late 90s and in the 2010 to 2015 area. Those pictures are exactly what China was like in the 90s. I've been to a city, Jinan, where the river that went right through the city is that color. I've been in cities where you can't see across the street. If you look from the air when you're flying around China, you can actually see all the coal-fired power plant smokestacks. The labor conditions were terrible. People that lived there would live in a 4-foot by 6-foot box and share a washroom with 50 other people. And so there was no privacy. Agriculture, you can see that lower picture in the agriculture. Every single piece of agricultural land was experiencing pollution. So then you got contaminated food products. And that bottom right picture is simply a plant and how sloppy they were run in the early 90s. And that basically, those are all VOCs that just pour out to the atmosphere. I'm pretty sure that fellow's probably dead by now, but because the carcinogens coming off of that would have been incredible. So then you look at how many manufacturing jobs actually left. And so this is United States data. You can divide by 10 and you have Canadian data. Well, if you look at the numbers, 14 million down to, what's that? Let's see, about 7 million manufacturing jobs left since the early 1980s. The jobs that left first were the $30, $40 an hour jobs. They were the high-paying jobs. Corporations were using the movement of factories to other jurisdictions to knock down labor rates, and they succeeded. But if you think about what actually happened beyond that, we talk about in economic development circles, if you attract one manufacturing job, you attract X other support jobs. Well, we lost all those jobs, and we lost the support jobs that went with them. But the other side effect was the remaining jobs, the negotiating power was on the employer side. So wages started dropping in manufacturing. Now I think in southwestern Ontario, if you get a manufacturing job over $18 an hour, you're lucky. Foreign exchange. Well, if you want to kind of get a flavor for how much cash left the economy, when it goes to China, everything flows through the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, and they hold the foreign exchange balance for the country. And so this is a net balance because they had outflows and inflows. So their net balance grew to $3.84 trillion from next to nothing in the early 80s. So that's an indication of the amount of cash that left our economy to go there. Then you look at federal deficits. Well, if you're losing all those jobs and the rest of the jobs are going down in terms of net wages, and you're losing the support jobs, well, your taxation revenue is going down. on a per capita basis. Right there, you can see how the U.S. deficit has moved up until, that's 2009 or 10, but right now, if you were to extend that graph, we'd be well up through the ceiling because it's at $21.8 trillion as of this year, and their this year deficit is $1.1 trillion. If you divided that by 10 to get to our population, in pro rata terms, that would mean our deficit would be about $100 billion. Ours was only, $14 billion as announced last week. So in terms of managing fiscally, our governments, plural, have actually been doing a pretty good job. You look at Canada and Ontario, well, same deal. We had a little respite for a period of time in the federal government, but generally, deficits are going up, and there's not anything you can do to stop it because wage and value degradation of people has been continuing, and it's going to continue into the future. If you look at Ontario deficits, same story. It's really next to impossible to rein these deficits in unless we have a paradigm shift of some kind. So, to sum that part of the presentation, we let companies import almost anything from the outside. We didn't apply any controls on them at all, and we thought it would improve our global competitiveness as a nation. What it actually did was it gutted our competitiveness as a nation. Well, okay. This is kind of a graph that indicates what happened to wages. So the blue line is what it was back in the early 80s. If you look at disparity amongst population, we had a healthy middle class. And then if you look at today's curve, the red curve, what you see is that there's an awful lot of people, more than 55% of the population, are now earning incomes down below a living wage. And then if you look at the upper end of the scale, we have fewer people earning exponentially more money. And we'll touch on why that happened later. And if you look at the area between the two graphs, that's the amount of cash that left our economy in terms of wages that we no longer have government taxation revenue from. Now, if you look at this as United States data, the GDP is an indicator of how wealthy the economy is doing, and real wages should typically trend along with it. But they split in the early 80s. And the gap between the two of those is actually an indicator of lost incomes of households. If you look at the bottom right, there's a little note. Every one of those gray vertical lines represents a recession. And every single recession, the GDP would drop maybe 2 or 3%, but real wages would drop between 5 and 10%. And the loss would carry forward for quite a few months after the GDP corrected. And if you look at from about 1990 to the near present time, wages have been flat. In fact, they declined in between. And so the household had very little influence on how to raise its own income. So if we looked at what household lost in dollar terms, well, that area on a household basis in the United States that total area was $21.8 trillion. Of salaries left the U.S. economy. And on a per family unit basis, if you calculate the number of households between then and now, every household is down $6,400 in taxable income that they should have been earning had we not lost our competitive advantages. If you look at the taxation benefit of that $6,400 a household, that would make it easy for governments to rein in deficits based on policy and choices. If you divide that by 10, you get about the Canadian experience. And if you look at the household experience, it's not a lot different than $6,400 a household. Then you look at, this graph came out about a month and a half ago, I think, in the newspaper about, we had record low unemployment rates in Canada, down to 5.4%. And if you look at recessions, you can see where the recessions are. They're the big spikes in unemployment. Well, in the 80s, when we had a recession, unemployment would spike incredibly high. And then it would take 4 or 5 years before the economy would recover and unemployment would go down. Then the 90s, it spiked high too, but not quite as high. Then we had a small recession in 2000 that spiked a little bit. And then we had the housing meltdown in 2008, the third circle. But if you look at this graph, actually unemployment has been trending down since 1982, if you put a regression line through that graph. And what that tells us is that As we were losing our high-end jobs, we were creating more low-paying jobs, and as people fell off that blue curve onto the red curve, they were falling down and taking on jobs, either multiple jobs in some cases, or full-time at minimum wage, et cetera, et cetera. But it's an indicator that when we get the next recession, unemployment's not likely to spike high, but what's likely to happen is the next round of salary reductions is going to happen as corporations adjust themselves. Then if you think about the family unit, every single one of us here is unhappy about the situation in Canada, in the Canadian economy. We're unhappy about our household. Everybody's nervous about their kids getting jobs. I don't know how many of you young folks here are on gig economy jobs, short-term contracts where you're not sure what you're going to be earning next year or where you're going to be working. So everybody is nervous. They all know there's a problem, but nobody can quite point their finger at exactly what the problem is. And that first line in there, that is taken from before we had the $14 an hour bump in minimum wage. 11.5% of workers in Ontario earn minimum wage, and that's up from 1 in 40 in just a 20-year period. So if you think about that, that's 2.5%, 11%. Almost 1/3 of the people that work in Toronto are earning, living underneath about a minimum wage. And in Toronto, we talk about the big tech bubble. Well, in Toronto, there's only 90,000 jobs in the entire tech industry in Toronto that everybody celebrates. Well, that's not driving the economy. That's driving a niche of technology and advancement of automation and acceleration. So it's not a basis for building an economy on. It's a temporary situation. Now I want to talk about wealth siphons. If you remember, that's the second cancer that's affecting our society. If you look at those blue bars, that's the amount of dollars that multinational corporations were using to buy back their own shares on the various stock exchanges in the United States. So this year, $1.1 trillion is being spent. That's $3,000 for every single living American in the United States, leaving a company's balance sheet that was built, that cash balance was built by the work of every employee of that company. It goes onto the balance sheet. The CFO, the president, and the board decide, well, if we buy back our shares, we reduce the denominator and our share price will go up faster. And by the way, I can cash in my stock options and make a killing myself. And that's the opinion of the boards, the CEOs, and the CFOs of these large companies. There's a reason why Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates have hundreds of billions of dollars. It's because they can leverage that sort of behavior. It was legalized in 1982 in the United States and has taken hold of the economy. And now a company like Apple, as an example, I forget how many years ago, but 3 or 4 years ago, they had a float of 5.6 billion shares. They bought down enough shares that they're down to about 4.3 billion shares. So they bought down 20% of the entire share base using capital off their balance sheet to drive up stock price. But yet their income has almost been flat for 4 years. So they were doing that to create wealth, but not creating wealth for the economy. They were pulling wealth out of the economy and not reinvesting. Small independent businesses, these are all the hundreds of companies we have in the Sault, like Helene, like even Algoma Steel, to all the mom and pop shops that we have. None of those people can benefit from wealth siphons or geopolitical compromise. They're victims of it. So they have to build up their business and compete in a marketplace that's really tough. They're subject to every other force in the global marketplace, including artificial intelligence and AI. And they tend to serve regional markets, like Algoma Steel is mostly North American. And then if you look at corporations and big business, all of this behavior is accumulated into these four notions that corporations have really no option but to devalue their home market even more. Because where they were generating wealth was manufacturing abroad, importing back to their home country, living off of the wealth that was built up over generations in that country. But now they're forced to even cut costs more because their lives are getting more competitive. So the main reason now to create jobs domestically is actually because we have strong legal systems, we have strong financial systems. So if it weren't for those predictable systems and the instruments that they can use to create wealth, like wealth siphons, then we would be in a whole heap of trouble more. And you can imagine what life is like in countries that do not have structured systems as we have. And then, so this is actually to the detriment of the corporation itself, to the detriment of every household, and to the detriment of government. But not to the detriment, it's only to the advantage of those small group of individuals who take money out of the economy. Well, kind of wondering, this actually is about climate change. You wouldn't know it, but it's coming. And so you look at confidence in government, and these next two slides are pretty sensitive, but I truly believe this, and so I'm going to say it anyways. Confidence in government has been declining steadily in the United States and Canada for a long time. And why it's declining is households do not know who to blame for the reductions in salaries and the increased level of stress in the household. Like even we had this recent thing with autism in the province, where the province wanted to make a cut, but then they have to turn back the clock and undo that. Well, the pressure on the government is they've got to find cost cuts, but the pressure on the household is they have needs, and they think that an advanced economy should have those needs filled. And so people struggle in their households on who to blame and where to go to find a resolution to the stresses they're feeling. And therefore, all of our confidence in government is going down the toilet. So you got to wonder, why did politicians do it in the first place? Why did they set up NAFTA in a way? Why did they set up international trade with China? Well, there's a couple realities about politicians, and I think we might as well admit that it's consistent around the world. This is not peculiar to Canada. Political leadership is a bunch of favors. Everybody knows there's lobby groups all over the place. Almost every politician is in the political framework for a short period of time. Sometimes 4 years, sometimes 8, sometimes more. And so they spend part of their time negotiating relationships that would benefit them after office. And so they're susceptible to compromise when lobby groups come and push a policy platform forward. The worst case is that I was thinking when I brainstormed this slide was, did politicians and their staff not actually analyze that this could happen, and to think that this would be a natural outcome of just opening up our borders to any products that wanted to come in here? Well, corporations are now the control of policy at government. They are not us citizens. Us citizens, if you look at the cartoon, which is dead nuts right, us citizens do not have much of a voice, and that's one reason why we're also negative on elections. We don't feel like we can enact positive change because we don't believe our governments will actually implement positive change, and we actually don't believe that they even know what to do because we struggle with what to do. None of us have ideas. And then the bottom point, this is my cynical point, corporations that deal and benefit from this international trade and this wealth siphoning, they love social issues that divide political parties. Like the Me Too movement, any distraction from the fiscal organization that's going on in society, corporations love it because then their marketing and communications can take an ethical stance on an issue as long as it doesn't bring focus onto the capital structure and the capital processes that these corporations do. So that's why you'll see companies like Nike, everybody putting out all these positive communiques, and we feel good about the company. But you go ahead and challenge their manufacturing structure and start aiming at where they're not taking part in the world in a fair manner, well, then your opinion changes. The one thing I wanted to note is that this is not a political party thing. It's not conservatives, liberals, NDP, it's everybody. The United States, it's not Republican or Democrat, it's everybody. The core of government for the last 50 years has been influenced far too strongly by corporations who are demanding trade as a solution to economic woes, while trade without responsibility is what we're seeing in Sault Ste. Marie. 59% of the people that live and work in Sault Ste. Marie over the age of 15 are earning under a living wage, and that does not even factor in the precarious workers. we're probably in the 65% range. Then you go to rich Waterloo, Ontario, well, it's 55% there. Every single community in the United States and Canada is struggling with exactly the same social problems that we struggle with here in Sault Ste. Marie. And that's the nut I was trying to crack when I was looking at strategy for the Innovation Center. So another indicator of what's going on in the world, I don't know how to tie this into this talk, but what I noticed was migration of humans around the world is just accelerating. And so I think what we can presume from that, there's probably a lot of reasons that I don't understand, but one of the things we can presume is that the value of humans from a corporate employment perspective and government perspective is trending downward in a lot of places around the world. And that's a sad state of affairs. So that sort of insinuates more unstable governments, more irrational governments, more overt control of people. Now we're going to talk about climate change. You guys can all go online and read tons of stuff about climate change. Well, it really comes down to a simple couple of facts. The bottom graph on the right talks about CO2 levels in the atmosphere for the past million years. The red line on the graph beside it is that level. So since about the 1950s and 60s, we've been over the tipping point for the last number of ice ages in CO2 level in the atmosphere. And now we are, if you look at accumulation of CO2 and then greenhouse gas equivalents like methane, we are now over the 500 range, and I think we're probably creeping up to even further up on that. And if you look at where the pollution's coming from, well, the other graph kind of segments, but if you look at China as an example, their population only went up 30%, but their contribution to greenhouse gases went up over 500% in a very short period of time. India is going. Logistics takes up 2.5%. And you can look at the United States. Well, the United States today is actually trending up. The United States is the largest greenhouse gas emitter on the planet. China's number 2, Russia's number 3, and India's number 4. And those 4 countries emit more than 60% of global CO2 emissions. So for us to sit here in Canada and think, oh, we got to curb our own emissions, if we don't, in parallel, create pressure on international trade to drop those emissions of other countries and work together as countries, well, we might as well just forget the game. We got to create a system that engages, even if it means temporary conflict with other countries. Now, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, this one's from NOAA, but of all the CO2 emissions that go into the atmosphere every year, half of it repatriates right back to Earth the same year in the form of acid rain or just coming back into contact with plants, that sort of thing. But what is it, 70% of the planet's covered in water? Well, so what we're doing is we're putting up CO2 in the atmosphere, but we're acidifying our oceans. And you can see the acidification curve where that orange arrow is. And so we're already trending down. Every 0.1 of loss in pH is a 30% increase in acidification. That's what's contributing to the degradation of life in the ocean, food chains, that sort of thing, hurting everything, coral reefs. And you can see how fast it's projected to go down unless we rein in climate change. Now, China, that's a current graph of China. You can see they're doing a lot of good at the top of the graph, where they're putting wind power in, solar, nuclear, and hydroelectric. You can almost see where they opened the Three Gorges Dam, where the hydroelectric gets pretty big. But underneath it all, they are still heavily reliant on coal to fund the electricity demands of the country. Now, having lived in China, I can almost guarantee that every one of those coal-fired power plants does not have a single scrubber on them that's working. So a scrubber takes out sulfur dioxide and can reduce emissions and impact on the environment. Well, there's an area where they actually ought to be. If they're stuck on coal, cut it in half, because they can cut it in half with latest technology. So I already mentioned this. China's population only went up 30%, but their emissions went up a lot. Global population went up 40% and emissions increased by 100%. So it's not totally tied to population and growth of rates of population. I'm only going to touch a little bit on technology acceleration, but the one point here is that technology is changing at such a pace that not one person in this room, myself included, everybody else, even if you're a PhD techie, none of you understand how fast technology is moving, because it's moving in every single area of life. And it's impossible. So our ability to cope with it, we're actually not able to cope with it. So when technology comes upon us in surprising ways, sometimes we're filled with wonder, sometimes we're filled with shock. Accelerating technology, well, technology is going so fast that every one of us knows it, all of us at my age. Well, cassette tapes were really cool, but I still love my 8-track. And then we went to CDs, DVDs, and now sticks. Everything is going so fast. The next product is outstripped very quickly in the economy. And then there's a citation there about a book. We don't know how fast things are moving. Well, they're moving so fast that we actually don't know what's very close to us. The digital economy is creating lots of jobs now. And artificial intelligence doesn't exist yet, only machine learning does. But once artificial intelligence comes to pass where it's actually truly functional, well then all these little cool tech companies that you hear about that can create sight, can create smell, can create touch, create all these things about thinking and underlying programs, once you get true artificial intelligence, it can actually internalize and implement and incorporate those technologies. It doesn't need our help. And so you're going to be able to create robotics and technologies that will think and do everything on their own. They'll be able to see, hear, touch, communicate, translate to every single language, because every one of us knows that all these software programs exist, but not as AI-driven programs. So the blue letter is the thing that we have to think about. The disruption of technology is going to drastically affect every corporation, every household, every government around the world. And it's going to happen within 8 to 10 years. And this is because they're projecting that within 8 years, the laptop you buy at Staples is going to have the brain power of your entire brain. And then once that happens, the programs and the artificial intelligence that you have at your desktop can think as fast as you can and probably can learn faster and solve problems quicker. And if our governments are still mired in this deficit acceleration, poverty, and corporations and environmental issues, when that happens, we have no ability to cope with it. It's going to hit like a hammer. McKinsey did a study in the United States that projects kind of what Heather was talking about, is that they project over 70 million full-time jobs in the United States can be eliminated within 10 years in the United States, in all levels of the economy. So that's coming too. So why we should gasp? Well, all we've done so far as citizens when we elect people is we've been driving towards electing more populist government who focus on attacking cost structures of government, cost programs, how to squeeze drops, how to move money from bucket to bucket, because that's where they can feel they can make a difference, because even the government struggle with how to create more revenue. And pretty soon, and I think we're not that far away from it, the apathy that we have for this federal election, I'm totally apathetic personally on it, because both parties are not going to, both leading parties are not going to address the geopolitical compromises at all in their platforms, because we haven't demanded it, we haven't identified it, and we're not forcing them to do it. And in parallel to all that, the planet keeps degrading. And ignorance really dominates the public on this. The public cannot understand how to engage enough to influence change, to demand their local candidates think through these processes. Then I wanted to touch on carbon taxes. There's no way a carbon tax can work. And the reason is simple. A carbon tax operates within a country, within your own borders. You tax your people, and you take that money and you drag it through the government bureaucracy. So let's say it's $10 billion. Well, here I read an article in Financial Post that they thought the carbon tax program in Canada would be $11.4 billion. So if you did collect that $11.4 billion and you dragged it through the economy, through government bureaucracy, maybe $6 billion comes back as a useful program. Money gets wasted when it flows through the tax system and gets delivered into programs. And so it doesn't draw other countries into the fray. So to have a carbon tax working within our country is totally pointless. It won't change anything. Well, my talk so far is meant to give you an idea how severe the problems are. Every solution will have pain, and the menu of solutions that I want to talk about, I think need to be the ones that we get debated. Eliminate wealth siphons. Make it illegal to do share buybacks. Force that money that corporations earn to stay in the economy and get reinvested into whatever the corporation's priorities are. However, it takes $1 trillion out of an annual stock exchange, which is going to cause a huge correction on the stock market. So the best time to do that is when we hit our next recession. Then knock them out when companies aren't spending that money. This is a graphic that shows the environmental performance of every country around the world. If you look at that graph, you can spot where we are. You can spot where China is. There's a differential between a high-performing country on environmental policy and procedure and a low-performing country. If you look at one of the worst ones, it's Bangladesh over there. It's second from the bottom. China is, I think, near the bottom of the second column. Mexico is in there too. So these are kind of like the behaviors and represent policy within a country on environmental practices on air, water, and soil. Well, we should be tariffing countries based on that instead of a carbon tax. Put the carbon tax on imports from country and prorate it to the amount of work those countries have to do to improve their own environmental performance. How you do it? You pick the product categories that can have the most impact. You pick the countries that you think you can influence positive change in. Then I thought I would look at, because a big part of geopolitical compromise is just using people, using cheap labor abroad. Well, I looked at this index prepared by, I think, University of British Columbia is one of the groups. The Fraser Institute is one of the groups. Well, if you look at Economic and Personal Freedom Index, a couple of interesting things. You wonder why Hong Kong is protesting so much and why they're so diligent. Well, look at where they rank. They rank number 3 in economic freedom and personal freedoms. There's no way they're going to give it up, and they're standing up for it. So China is trying to drive down the regulations so they have less freedoms. And so the point that this slide is here for is to indicate that, well, the environmental grid very closely resembles this grid when you're ranking countries. And so by attacking the environmental performance of countries, you're also in parallel attacking the human personal freedoms and economic freedom of citizens in that country. So if those countries move to start correcting their environmental performance, in parallel, we can expect that they will improve their human rights performance as well. And this is one that I believe in strongly. Right now, 2.5% of all CO2 emissions are logistics-oriented ships. Well, it's going to grow a lot. That's a shot off of marinetraffic.com. But every single ship that's out there is burning bunker C oil, which is a very high polluting form of fuel. I think we should be putting tariffs and import duties on anything that comes on a boat. And what that does is it drives two behaviors. One, the shipping and logistics industry has to move to hydrogen or battery technology faster, and we make it economically painful not to do so. The second thing it does is it promotes local sourcing of goods because it fuels the balance to be more favoring towards local suppliers. And that drives a bigger chance to repatriate jobs back to Canada. So how much time do we have? Well, all I did was listen to a whole bunch of people talk about it. Even Dr. David Suzuki made a comment last week that he actually thinks it's too late, that we can't recover the planet. But in any event, how much time do we have? Well, I think we have 2 4-year government cycles at the federal level. And if they don't get their act together, then it doesn't really matter what they do after that. It's just a game of stalling. And why 8 years? Because in about 8 to 10 years, AI is going to start hammering jobs to a significant tune in Canada, and governments will not be able to drive revenue at all. They're going to go broke. And within 11 years, the Arctic ice caps are destined to go to zero every summer, but the permafrost is going to start releasing more methane and will become the driver of methane emissions. Right now, the drivers are cattle, 1.6 billion cows on the planet, fracking. Canada and the United States are the largest frackers in the world, and so the amount of methane that comes out of that is incredible. And the United States is by far the largest methane emitter, and landfills. But recently, the last 3 years, methane emissions have popped up 18% in some areas of the planet. But fracking hasn't changed, landfills haven't changed, and cattle haven't changed. So chances are it's coming from permafrost. That's the next biggest sink. And if you look at that, I put that little graph up there again, the gap between CO2 emissions and non-CO2 emissions that are greenhouse gases like methane is growing at a substantial rate relative to CO2. The picture on the bottom right is in Siberia, and every one of those craters is a methane pocket that popped loose. So you can see the size of these things, and that's just a big burp of methane that goes up into the atmosphere. The land caves in underneath it, and you've got a crater. So methane, I thought I would check methane concentrations in the atmosphere because I actually didn't know when I was preparing this deck. Well, there's the last million years, and then you can see where we are. And if you watch that, I think that Independence Day, is that the movie? The guy goes, oh crap, he's just about to die. But you can see that it's gone overboard in a very short period of time. Nobody can deny that this is not a man-induced or humankind-induced phenomenon, climate change and methane emissions. So if you look at, we celebrated the 50th year of landing on the moon. Well, since we landed on the moon, we basically destroyed our planet. So if any of you care about family incomes, jobs, and your kids' future, you care about government being able to provide good basic services like healthcare, education, social services, you want a safe society, and you also care about climate change. Because all of this basically comes in large part due to geopolitical compromises and wealth siphons. So I'm not sure what you've taken away from my talk, but it should motivate you to get in the face of your local federal politicians, the candidates that are running today, and demanding them to answer the question on how they're going to engage the globe in CO2 reductions and methane reductions. Because if they can't answer you, don't vote for them. They don't deserve your vote, period. But now is the positive side of it. And this is what, at the Innovation Center, why I did this. I wanted to get to this point. Urgencies, opportunities. Well, if we collected, say, $12 billion in tariffs in lieu of carbon taxes, we could allocate a percentage of that internally to our economy to accelerate our greening programs. It could be anything. Funding indigenous programs around the care of the earth. It could be electric vehicle infrastructure. It could be hydrogen charging stations. It could be anything. Well, there's $8 billion you could pour right back into your economy. But then you also need to help the world. So we can then invest into programs in international that are aimed directly at curbing emissions. Like 300 million people in India do not have electricity yet. Do you think if we don't start partnering with India, creating agreements with India, that they're going to be fed electricity from coal or nuclear? It's going to be coal. China, in its Belt and Road policy, are cutting back on their coal emissions or coal-fired power plant construction in their own country, but they're building 200 in other countries, all through Africa, through the middle, through Bangladesh, Pakistan, in a whole bunch of areas as they create their trade routes. So if governments actually acted to eliminate compromises, the number of opportunities for investors, entrepreneurs would go through the roof to an extent that we haven't seen since the end of World War II. It'll drive a sense of global responsibility, put upward pressure on wages, and put into motion forces that will rein in climate change. And Canada can only lead if our elected officials actually take action on this and actually do it and have the guts to do it. Now, I actually don't think the core leaders of our federal parties have it in them because they're still too strongly influenced by the corporations and the lobby groups. But to me, it's the backbenchers. It's the people out in the communities that are getting told what they need to do. Those are the people that are working for their communities. The backbenchers could actually rise up and demand that their parties look at this. And if you think about opportunities, look how obvious they are. There's just tons of them. But then when you stop to brainstorm and think about it, you can start to clarify on where opportunity is going to emerge. Well, plant-based foods is one that's already emerging. It's about, a $400 million market today, but studies are showing it's projecting to a $3 billion a year market. There's businesses there to be created. And all these other areas, aquaculture, eliminating fast food disposables, et cetera, every single one of them is an opportunity for entrepreneurs, whether you're Indigenous, an immigrant newcomer, a person living in Sault Ste. Marie, a young person graduating from Algoma University, or you're just a frustrated employee with an idea and you're just wondering if the market is there. Well, in the next 8 years, the market is there for every single one of these things. Not one of these business areas will fail if you're an entrepreneur and you're aggressive in it. And when I looked at that for the Innovation Center, we're actually going after the top one. We're going to create a plant-based food business right here in Sault Ste. Marie, and we're going to gun for it to be a multi-million-dollar business. And in parallel to that, we are going to become expert in biodegradable packaging and food packaging, and we're going to look for the technologies and bring them to the Sioux and commercialize it here in support of our plant food business. That's the area that we have expertise in because we have the RAIN group, we have the software group, and we actually have the ability to create this business. What can you guys do? And any one of you or any one of your organizations could spot an entrepreneur to dive in and do the same thing. Like I have one in there, converting disposable products to durable products. I actually brought a fan, but I left it in the car. I bought a fan at Walmart last year when I first moved here because everybody told me you don't need air conditioning in Sault Ste. Marie, but you damn well do need air conditioning in Sault Ste. Marie because it was hot last year. So I bought a fan. Well, about 2 months ago, it conked out. I had it for 13 months. Like, what good is a fan that lasts 13 months? I actually think we should be working to put a 5-year mandatory full parts and labor warranty on every durable good that's made and imported. And that would drive an entire economy on that service industry coming back so that we get the Maytag guy coming back. Like, why should we buy a dishwasher and 2 years later have to go buy another one? Because you can't repair it economically. It makes no sense. So here's a quick look at another one that we're not tackling, but I hope somebody does. In North America, in the United States, 50 billion water bottles are put into garbage every single year in just water bottles, not pop bottles or Gatorades, just water bottles. Of them, 29% is put into recycling because those are the communities that have recycling programs. Of that, only 7% is actually recycled into another product, meaning 93% of every water bottle ends up in landfill or in our waterways or our streams or our parks, everywhere. And so, and Coca-Cola uses like 3 million tons of plastic a year just for Coca-Cola. If you look at the price of water, like every single one of us feels guilty carrying a Tim Hortons coffee cup or a bottle of water because we all know it's going into the garbage. It's not benefiting anybody, but we don't know what to do about it. But, well, if you look at the opportunities, like a 1.5 liter bottle of water is $2.27. Who could design and build a system that actually can deliver water to a consumer for less than that? Pretty much everybody can. It's the equipment, it's the delivery system, it's the logistics, and it all drives employment, it drives wealth, and we can create that right here. Just takes one entrepreneur with a solution, who's got the drive to partner with manufacturing and do it. And the comment I wanted to make about Sault Ste. Marie, well, every city in the world is struggling with exactly the same problem that we are. So to think we can wait for a solution and then us benefit from it in terms of job growth, well, that's not going to happen. It's the cities that generate the entrepreneur and the courage to actually go out and build these businesses and that are global, that are going to create the wealth and repatriate the wealth back to their communities first. And that's what I want for Sault Ste. Marie. And that's the process we went through with my board, was to look at this and look at right in the face and see what's really going on. So the Northern Advantage, well, we're small. We're small enough to be really fast. We're big enough to matter. We have hundreds of thousands of people. We've got universities, colleges. We've got intellectual capital. We've got industrious people. We've got people that have that sort of, like, I actually see it as a northern toughness, because I'm not from the north, but you guys have a northern toughness to you that should make you quality entrepreneurs. And the other thing that we have here is we have an angel network up here that's one of the biggest in North America. And so we got the capital too. So there's really no excuse for anybody who spots a climate-oriented entrepreneurial opportunity that you can't start a business in it. And so I don't know if this is an end, but you know, all of you have a choice to make on whether you're going to go home and just get your Tims on the way home and not do anything and just say, yeah, it was a fun presentation, but I'm not going to call Sunny Spina or the Liberal Party or the Green Party. I'm not going to stir the pot. Well, you know what? Stir the pot. Because what does it matter? It matters a whole lot more if you don't than if you do. And I saw this cartoon. Oh, darn it. This cartoon. The first part of it just says, hey, just do nothing. It's impossible. But if you turn around and read it from the other side, it says, just do it. Nothing's impossible. And I actually firmly believe it. So when I look at the Innovation Center, what we're going to do, I gave this presentation to my board, and I have Asma Vezina, I have Dr. Common, president of the hospital, a number of their business leaders of the community. Every single one of them said, we got to act on this quicker. So we're going to act quick. The university has already talked to me that they want to create a partnership around entrepreneurship. So see if we can jack up the number of entrepreneurs in the community, and then how do we, and us and the EDC and Future Sault Ste. Marie, how do we bundle around these entrepreneurs to get them to go really fast? And how do we work with our funding partners, FedNor and OHFC, to actually drive these businesses quicker, get them ahead of the competition? I actually like competition. It's kind of fun. And so I'm hoping that we uncover a lot more people in this city and region that have this entrepreneurial bent, because we're in such a dire strait on a planetary basis, the opportunities are incredible. Make that connection in your head and then act on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice topic and presentation. I learned personally a lot from this. I have a question. You talked about the external pollution or CO2 emission control, like imposing tariff restriction on imports, right? That's for external commodities, other countries, like we may think about, you talking about America, China, Russia. How about internal? So we have now carbon tax. So the negative side of it is the government is imposing it to the consumers, not the business that is polluting or emitting the carbons a lot. So the textbook case is actually, you are talking about, if a negative externality, impose tax on that who produce. Right, that's the not a good side in that respect. But what do you think to control internal pollution, internal CO2 emission? What should be the best thing?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. We do need regulation to come back a little stronger. The reason the United States is emitting more is that Trump administration has been clawing back regulations. Emissions go up immediately. There has to be a balance of regulation because people operate within the bounds that they're controlled. So regulations need to stiffen up. And if you think about a carbon tax on an internal basis versus a tariff, a carbon tax is something you're probably going to pay and you can't get around it. If they put it on gas, we're still going to drive our cars. And so you're almost forced to pay that tax. Well, if a consumer, and me included, is forced to pay a tax, and let's say it is what the commercials are saying, $800 or $900 a year, I'm going to find other ways to cut my taxes in other ways. And so the net that the government's going to get out of me is going to be less because I'm going to go out of my way to find other ways to cut my taxes elsewhere. And so, and if you look at the tariffs, if we were to strengthen regulations on emissions, but have external tariffs that are going to raise whatever, $10 to $12 billion, and then we put, say, 8 of that billion back into our domestic country, well, you can aim it at areas where the biggest impact can be had. Like, I don't know how much Algoma Steel emits, but what if we put $100 million into making sure there's no pollution coming out of there? I don't know, that might be the smartest investment. That might be the biggest emitter. Always look at the biggest emitter first, and then make your investments to reduce that. And then over time, if you do this for 5 years, and you've implemented $40 billion of emissions project, you've poured $40 billion back into the economy, to jobs, to engineers, to contractors, to the plants, because they aren't bearing the whole burden of the emission control, so you're keeping them competitive. The other way, it just crams down the household spending power. We already have record debt as a household on average in the country. So taxing internally is not the right thing. A tariff, nobody has to buy the product. So if they tariff Nike shoes from China, and instead of $100, it's 120, you as a household don't have to buy it at 120. You can say, no, I'll buy somebody else's. So you have the option of allocating your own money. Nobody has taken that away from you. Carbon tax people take away your options. And that's the thing I don't like about it. But if we pour billions back into electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, then we are going to drive down that. And like even on water bottles, I think the government should ban plastic bags in grocery stores immediately right now. That can be done immediately. Nobody needs them anymore. Plastic water bottles, give them 3 years. So industry, you have 3 years to eliminate plastic water bottles. That's regulation, but it forces innovation. And if an entrepreneur's fast enough, there's a lot of room for building businesses. That's sort of the strategy.
Yeah. If I'm allowed to ask a quick question, is you estimated 8 to 10 years for AI to take over the jobs of others. So what is the, how do you estimate that 8 to 10?
Well,
Why not more or less?
I just looked at professors and people that have been lecturing all around the world. Like Singularity University has a number of lectures in California that talk about the rate of change and the rate of implementation of AI. All the majors like Morgan Stanley and McKinsey have all been publishing impact documents where they're guessing at what the impacts are. And so every one of those was an input for me, and then I just am repeating what I found that the experts are saying. Oh,
Hey,
not
Peter.
Jason.
Excellent presentation. Thank you. It would appear from your graphs and your data that the electrification of the auto industry and the electrification of the airline industry isn't necessarily taken into account in some of these graphs that you're showing here today. Could you clarify that for us? And secondly, if that is the case, what opportunity do you think that lends itself to Northern Ontario? I think that's why a lot of us are here. And if that trend is one of the solutions to help us reverse some of these impacts that you're talking about today, where can we as Northern Ontario come together as a group to maybe create some of the electricity needed for the electrification of both industries?
Well, we have our wind farm up here. We have all kinds of capability to create clean energy through solar or wind up here. Wind energy in the United States is now 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour delivered to the utility grid. What you're doing when you put up wind farms is you're generating power in a period of time during the day, so you get a tremendous spike. And so that means that you're selling off surplus electricity to the grid and to the United States, so it's not a gain. But if you look at the overall picture, if a company up here were to all of a sudden say, work with the government, install EV charging stations all the way down the line through Sudbury to Timmins to connect it all so that EVs could be easily accessible in the north, that's one way. The other way would be to take advantage of the hydrogen economy, because we have hydrogen companies in Ontario that are world class. We could easily put as much wind farms as we want, and without changing our electrical grid, convert that into hydrogen fuel stations and be a leader in hydrogen fuel. And that really works well on large transport vehicles, mining trucks, like the heavy industry where you need big power, where to me, electrification doesn't make any sense. Because of where we're situated, that a first mover in that area in hydrogen power of large vehicles would be almost a no-brainer. And then partnering with the trucking industry to be that energy partner would work. The projections, I talked about future projections of climate change. The actual Paris Accord does not project any climate change degrading for at least 30 more years. If you look at how they set up the Paris Accord, China could jack up their emissions until 2020 and then start trending them down. So they were all jacking up their emissions to get to a baseline that they could slowly degrade from. So, like to me in the north, electrification, like McDougall Energy is an example. If they became a leader, acquired the latest battery charging technology for EVs and owned it, and then started distributing that across the north and even moving into southwestern Ontario, they can create all kinds of wealth from that. It's just timing the market. But I think you got to acquire the intellectual property first. So companies like that can move really fast. Like aquaculture, I think our Indigenous communities can make incredible businesses out of aquaculture if they wanted to. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but every single business, if they studied the implications of climate change, can identify areas of growth. Okay.
Thank you very much, Peter.